A man went into the Wyoming wilderness to do something he had done many times before. Go hunting. But within a matter of hours, something would happen out there that still cannot be fully explained today. A rifle would fire, but the bullet would behave in a way that defies physics. The man would black out, and when he came back, nothing would ever fully make sense again. What he later described would become one of the most disturbing and controversial unexplained cases ever recorded in the American wilderness. On the afternoon of the 25th of October 1974, a 41-year-old man named Carl Higdon pointed his work truck towards the vast expanse of the Medicine Bow National Forest in southern Wyoming. Carl worked on an oil rig, a tough job for a tough man, and he'd managed to get off a little early that day. His plan was simple and one he cherished: to go elk hunting. He wasn't just going anywhere, though. He'd heard whispers from other hunters about a specific spot, a place called McMarty Canyon, where the elk were said to be plentiful. As the truck ate up the miles on the paved road, Carl felt the tension from the work week just melt away. He looked out at the endless evergreen trees, the distant mountains capped with early season snow, and a deep sense of calm settled over him. This was his element. Carl was a true outdoorsman, the kind of person who felt more at home in the quiet of the wilderness than anywhere else. For him, solitude wasn't something to be avoided, it was something to be embraced. For a little while, he was just a man and the wilderness, driving along, enjoying the peace. Eventually, the smooth pavement ended. The road gave way to a long, rocky trail that snaked its way deeper into the forest. Now, this truck wasn't his. It belonged to his company, and the last thing he wanted was to damage it trying to navigate this rough terrain. So, he made a practical decision. He pulled over to the side of the trail, shut off the engine, and got out. He gathered his rifle and his gear, locked up the truck, and started the rest of the journey on foot. The hike wasn't easy. The trail was not only covered in loose rocks that made every step a careful one, but it was also a steady uphill climb. It didn't take long for Carl to feel the strain. He started having trouble catching his breath. This wasn't just because of the exertion or the altitude. Years ago, Carl had survived a serious bout of tuberculosis. While he had recovered, the disease had left its mark, riddling his lungs with scar tissue. It was a constant reminder, a physical limitation that made strenuous activity a real challenge. But Carl was determined. He wasn't the type to give up easily. He just pushed on, taking it slow. Every few minutes, he'd stop, bend over with his hands on his knees, and just focus on pulling air into his protesting lungs. After about 30 minutes of this slow and steady climb, he noticed a change in the landscape. The dense trees began to thin out, and the sky opened up above him. He had finally arrived. He was standing at the edge of McMarty Canyon. The place had a unique feel to it. It was like standing in a giant, natural bowl. The floor of the canyon was mostly flat, covered in shrubs, patches of grass, and a few scattered trees. All around the edges, tall hills rose up, creating that distinct bowl-like impression. Carl stopped for a moment, taking it all in, letting his breathing return to normal. He scanned the area, his hunter's eyes searching for any sign of movement. And then he saw them. Straight across the canyon, grazing peacefully in the distance, was a group of 5 elk. He couldn't believe his luck. To arrive at a spot for the first time and immediately find what you're looking for, it was almost too good to be true. A surge of adrenaline cut through his fatigue. He immediately dropped into a stealthy crouch, using the sparse cover to his advantage. He began to move slowly, deliberately, placing each foot carefully to avoid snapping a twig or scuffing a rock. His focus was entirely on the elk. When he finally felt he was within a reasonable shooting distance, he stopped. He slowly raised his rifle, the familiar weight of it a comfort in his hands. He settled the stock against his shoulder, brought his eye to the scope, and took aim at the largest elk in the group. He controlled his breathing, just like he'd done 1,000 times before. He let out half a breath and held it, his finger gently squeezing the trigger. And then he pulled it. But nothing happened. There was no deafening crack of the rifle, no powerful kick against his shoulder. There was just silence. It was as if the gun hadn't fired at all. He was confused for a second, thinking maybe the safety was on or the rifle had jammed. But then he saw something that completely defied all logic, something that his mind simply could not process. At the exact same moment, a dizzying wave of vertigo washed over him. The entire world seemed to tilt on its axis. He felt himself falling, a strange, weightless sensation, and then everything went black. The next thing Carl was aware of was a violent shaking. Someone was shaking him back and forth, trying to rouse him. His eyes fluttered open, blinking against a darkness he didn't recognize. A pounding headache throbbed behind his eyes, and a thick fog of confusion clouded his thoughts. He realized he was sitting upright, but he wasn't on the ground in the canyon. He was back in the driver's seat of his work truck. He looked out the windows, but the surroundings were all wrong. This wasn't where he had parked. The trees were different, the ground was different. The shaking started again, more insistent this time, and a voice cut through the darkness, saying his name. He looked up and could make out the silhouettes of two men standing outside his open door. He didn't know them. They were trying to ask him questions to find out what was going on, but when Carl tried to answer, his mouth felt strange and numb. The words that came out were a jumbled, garbled mess. He couldn't form a coherent sentence. The two men exchanged a look, clearly realizing they weren't going to get any answers from him in this state. They gave up trying to talk to him, and instead, they carefully lifted him out of the truck. He felt their arms supporting him as they carried him over to their own vehicle. Through the haze, he heard one of them mention a hospital. Soon, he was in the back of their car, of two engines started, and they were driving off into the night. And once again, Carl's world faded to black. About 30 minutes later, just around midnight on October 26th, Carl's wife, Marjorie, burst through the door of a hospital room at the Carbon County Memorial Hospital. The sterile smell and the quiet beeping of machines filled the air. And there, in the bed, was Carl. He was hooked up to an IV, with various monitors tracking his vitals. A nurse stood beside him, checking his chart. Marjorie saw that his eyes were open, but they had a distant, unfocused look to them. He was staring at the ceiling, but it was clear he wasn't really seeing it. As Marjorie stood there, frozen in the doorway, trying to process the scene, the nurse noticed her. The nurse gestured towards Marjorie and then turned to Carl. She asked him a simple question, "Do you know who this is?" Carl slowly turned his head and looked directly at his wife. But there was no recognition in his eyes, no flicker of familiarity. He just stared blankly at her for a long moment, then slowly shook his head and said, "No." Earlier that evening, Marjorie had been at home, growing more and more anxious. Carl was usually so reliable. When he said he'd be home by a certain time, he was home. But the hours had ticked by, and there was still no sign of him. Her worry eventually got the best of her, and she called the sheriff's department. She explained that her husband had gone hunting in McMarty Canyon and was long overdue. She asked if they could just send someone out to check on him. So, two deputies had driven out into the national forest. And they were the ones who found him, passed out and unresponsive in his truck. They were the two men who had shaken him awake and brought him to the hospital. But the story they told was bizarre. It wasn't just that they had found Carl unconscious. It was where they had found him. His truck was located a full 3 miles away from the main road, stuck deep in a muddy bog. And the strangest part of all was that there were no tire tracks. Not a single one leading to or from the vehicle. It was as if the multi-ton truck had just been dropped from the sky right into the middle of the mud. But at that moment, neither the deputies nor Marjorie were too concerned about the mystery of the truck. Their focus was entirely on Carl, who was lying in a hospital bed, a complete stranger to his own life. The doctor had spoken to Marjorie, explaining that Carl was severely disoriented and appeared to be suffering from profound amnesia. He couldn't remember his own name, let alone what had happened to him out in that canyon. The medical team had done everything they could. They ran a battery of tests, including x-rays and brain scans, searching for any sign of a head injury, a stroke, or anything that could explain his condition. But they found nothing. In fact, according to all the tests, he was in perfect physical health. There was no injury, no medical reason for his amnesia or his disorientation. The staff told Marjorie that since they couldn't find anything wrong with him, they didn't really know how to treat him. For the time being, all they could do was keep him under observation. Marjorie sank into a chair beside her husband's bed, her mind reeling. Nothing made sense. She was about to ask the nurse another question when Carl's body suddenly tensed up. He started looking around the room frantically, his eyes darting from one corner to the other as if he was searching for something desperately important. Then he started to speak, his voice agitated. "Where are my pills?" he asked, to no one in particular. "Where are they?" Marjorie had no idea what he was talking about. Carl didn't take any regular medication. The nurse was just as confused. Trying to soothe him, Marjorie reached out to take his hand. But the moment her skin touched his, Carl recoiled. He yanked his hand away and stared at her with a look of alarm, as if a complete stranger had just tried to touch him. It was a heartbreaking moment for Marjorie, seeing the man she loved look at her with such fear and confusion. 2 days passed. Carl slowly began to surface from the fog. He started to remember small things. He remembered his own name. And, to Marjorie's immense relief, he finally remembered who she was. Since all the medical tests continued to show that he was physically unharmed, the hospital decided to discharge him. The doctors theorized that perhaps being in a familiar environment back in his own home would help jog his memory and bring him back to normal. But when they got home, it quickly became obvious that Carl was not okay. He wasn't getting better. He was incredibly quiet, which was completely out of character for the usually talkative man. He would sit for hours, just staring into space. And when he did speak, it was often in that same frantic, nonsensical way he had in the hospital. He would suddenly get agitated, looking around the house, asking about his pills. He also started saying something new, something equally strange. He kept telling Marjorie that someone had stolen his elk. Marjorie would try to question him gently. "What pills, Carl?" "What do you mean someone took your elk?" But he couldn't explain. It was like he had these fragments of memory floating in his mind, but no context to put them in. He seemed just as confused by his own thoughts as she was. It was as if he was a prisoner in his own mind, haunted by memories that didn't make sense. Then, a few days after they returned from the hospital, something shifted. Carl came to Marjorie and told her he remembered something. A new specific memory from the hunting trip had surfaced. He described being in McMarty Canyon, seeing the elk, and raising his rifle. He told her again about pulling the trigger and how there was no sound and no kickback. But then he added the detail that he hadn't been able to articulate before. He said he saw the bullet leave the barrel of the rifle, but it was moving in extreme slow motion. He said it was like watching something move through thick syrup. He could see it tumbling end over end as it traveled slowly across the canyon. And then, he said, the bullet seemed to hit an invisible wall in midair. It just stopped dead. And then, the truly impossible part happened. He watched as the bullet seemed to turn itself inside out, flattening into a strange metallic disc before it simply fell to the ground. He said that as he watched the flattened bullet fall, he felt himself fall with it, and that's when he blacked out. Marjorie listened to the story, and her first thought was that it had to be a hallucination. Maybe his mind, desperate to fill in the huge blank spot in his memory, had simply invented this bizarre and impossible scenario. It was the only explanation that made any sense. But a few days later, that changed. Marjorie was doing laundry, going through the clothes Carl had been wearing on the day of his hunting trip. As she checked the pockets of his jacket before putting it in the wash, her fingers closed around something small, hard, and metallic. She pulled it out and looked at it in her palm. It was a round, flat, metal disc. At first, she had no idea what it could be. But then, her husband's strange story echoed in her mind. The bullet that flipped inside out and flattened. She stared at the object in her hand, a cold chill running down her spine. It looked exactly like a bullet that had somehow been turned inside out and pressed completely flat. She couldn't believe it. This discovery changed everything for Marjorie. She was now convinced that something truly extraordinary had happened to her husband in that canyon. It wasn't a fall or a medical episode. It was something else. Determined to find answers, she and Carl ended up in the office of a man named Dr. Leo Sprinkle, a psychology professor at the University of Wisconsin. Dr. Sprinkle was not a typical psychologist. He was a firm believer in the power of hypnosis, specifically its ability to help people access repressed memories. He believed that traumatic events could be locked away in the mind, and hypnosis was the key to unlocking them. This was exactly what Carl and Marjorie believed had happened to Carl. The memory was in there somewhere. They just needed help finding it. In the professor's quiet office, Marjorie sat on a couch, watching intently as Dr. Sprinkle began the session. He instructed Carl to close his eyes, to let his head hang down towards his chest, and to focus only on the sound of his own breathing. In and out, in and out. After several minutes, Dr. Sprinkle told Carl to slowly lift his head. Carl did, but his eyes remained closed. He was in a deep state of hypnosis. Then Dr. Sprinkle asked the question. Carl, I want you to tell me what happened on October 25th when you went hunting in McMarty Canyon. With his eyes still shut, Carl began to speak. His voice was steady and clear, and he began to tell a story so incredible that it left both Marjorie and Dr. Sprinkle completely speechless. Under hypnosis, Carl recounted the events just as he had remembered them before, but this time he didn't stop when he blacked out. He said that after he watched the bullet flatten and fall, he too fell to the ground. But he was only unconscious for a moment. When he opened his eyes, he was still lying in the grass, but he was no longer alone. Standing over him was a tall, dark figure. It was wearing a tight-fitting one-piece suit, like a scuba diver's wetsuit. He said the figure was shaped like a human, but it wasn't human. Its skin was a pale yellowish color. It had very small eyes, no visible ears, and its mouth was just a thin slit with no lips. Protruding from its forehead were two antennae. One of its arms ended in a flat stump, but the other had a strange attachment at the end, something that looked almost like a power drill. Then the creature looked down at him, and in perfect, unaccented English, it asked, "How are you?" Carl said he was so shocked to hear it speak that he just automatically replied, "Pretty good." The being seemed to accept this answer. It told Carl that its name was also One, and that it came from a planet that was 163,000 light-years from Earth. It assured Carl that it had no intention of harming him. In fact, it said it wanted to help him. Then, using its arm with the drill-like attachment, Also One reached into a pocket on its suit and pulled out a small packet. Inside were 4 pills. It told Carl that these pills would heal him. It offered one to Carl, and for some reason he couldn't explain, Carl felt no fear. He simply took the pill and swallowed it. After he'd taken it, Also One asked him if he wanted to go for a ride. And Carl, still in a state of strange calm, just said, "Sure." Also One helped Carl to his feet. As soon as he was standing, Carl saw a vehicle nearby that he hadn't noticed before. It was shaped like a perfect cube. In the next instant, without walking or moving, Carl said he was suddenly inside the vehicle. Also One was there with him, along with 2 other similar-looking beings. And, to his astonishment, so were the 5 elk he had been hunting. They were in a separate compartment behind a clear wall, like a transparent pen. Carl was sitting in a chair, as were the 3 beings. He then felt a powerful force press him back into his seat, the feeling of incredible acceleration. But less than a minute later, the vehicle came to a sudden stop. Also, Oyen turned to him and said, "We're home." The next thing he knew, he was standing outside the vehicle. The air was frigid and the sky was a deep, starless black. The landscape was utterly alien. It was rocky and desolate, with no trees, no grass, no sign of any life at all. In the distance, he saw a single, massive tower, a metallic structure that reminded him of the Seattle Space Needle. A light at the top of it was so intensely bright that it hurt his eyes to look at. Also, one led Carl, the other two beings, and the elk towards a door at the base of the tower. The door slid open silently, revealing not a room, but a space that looked like the inside of a large elevator. The entire group stepped inside, and they began to ascend. When the elevator stopped and the doors opened again, they were in a small, windowless room with metallic walls. On the floor were several raised platforms. Also, one directed the elk onto one of the platforms and then told Carl to stand on another one. Carl did as he was told. As soon as he was in place, a complex-looking device emerged from one of the walls. It began to move around him, starting at his head and working its way down to his feet, scanning him. He was vaguely aware that the elk were being scanned in the same way. When the process was finished, the device made a soft beeping sound and retracted back into the wall. Also, one looked over at Carl and said, "The elk are what we needed, but you're not. We're going to take you back to Earth now." And just like that, Carl said the next thing he knew, he was back in his work truck. The world was dark, and he was being shaken awake by the two sheriff's deputies. Back in Dr. Sprinkle's office, Carl finished his story. "Doctor." Sprinkle snapped his fingers, and Carl's eyes opened. The hypnosis was over. He looked around, a bit dazed, as if waking from a long dream. The three of them sat in complete silence, the air thick with the weight of Carl's unbelievable tale. As wild as it sounded, there were several undeniable physical facts about Carl's case that, up until that point, had been completely unexplainable. And the story he told under hypnosis, as impossible as it seemed, accounted for every single one of them. First, there was the matter of the truck. It was found 3 miles from where he parked it, stuck in a bog with no tire tracks. Investigators had been stumped. There was no conventional way for that vehicle to have gotten there. But if it had been transported, as Carl's story suggested, that would explain its impossible location. Second, there was the bullet. When Marjorie had a ballistics expert examine the flattened metal disc, they were baffled. They said there was no known force on Earth, no type of impact or pressure that could cause a bullet to deform in that specific way, to be essentially turned inside out. It defied the laws of physics as we know them. And the third, and perhaps most compelling piece of evidence, was found in Carl's own body. When the doctors at the hospital took x-rays of his chest, they found something medically impossible. For decades, Carl's lungs had been covered in thick scar tissue from his battle with tuberculosis. Those scars were on all his previous medical records. But on the new x-rays, they were gone. Completely vanished. The doctors had no explanation. It was as if his lungs had been miraculously healed. The story of also one giving him a pill that would heal him suddenly took on a chilling new significance. For decades, skeptics and researchers have picked apart Carl Higdon's story, trying to find a logical explanation for what happened that day. But no one ever has. No one has ever been able to offer a better explanation for the relocated truck, the physically impossible bullet, and the miraculous healing of his lungs. Because of this, the strange and unbelievable account of a Wyoming oil rigger remains one of the most credible and deeply unsettling alien abduction cases ever recorded. And to this day, there is still no clear explanation of what really happened to Carl Higdon in that forest. Some people believe it was a psychological breakdown. Others point to a series of coincidences that science is still struggling to fully explain. And a few people believe that it is something much more concerning than we are willing to accept. Because no matter how you look at it, 3 things remain true. A man ventures into the wilderness of Wyoming and returns with missing memories. A piece of metal that shouldn't exist. And a body has somehow been cured of a disease he had carried for decades. So the question is not just what happened to Carl Higdon. Are we really ready to know the answer? A woman called a moving company in New York and suddenly realized something was terribly wrong. The employee who answered the phone told her that her 8-year-old daughter, Eliza, never showed up for work that day. At first, the woman said nothing. Then her breathing changed. Her voice started trembling. And before hanging up, she quietly said she needed to call 911 immediately. Just moments earlier, she had walked into her house and found the entire place destroyed. Furniture overturned. Papers scattered everywhere. And upstairs, behind a locked bedroom door, was something waiting that would horrify detectives for months to come. That night, the 10th of August 2005, investigators in New York began looking into what appeared to be a violent home invasion. But as the evidence started coming together, they realized the killer wasn't a stranger who broke into the house. The killer was someone who had already been standing beside the family the entire time. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please tell the like button. You'll save them a seat at the movies, but then you put your code on it instead. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. In the early afternoon of Wednesday, the 10th of August 2005, 8-year-old Eliza Parsy was sitting on her bed in her Staten Island home, flipping through a fashion magazine. The house was quiet. Her mother, Seema, was at work, so Eliza had the place to herself until her own shift started later. Eliza had just graduated high school a few months earlier and was working as a clerk at a moving company. She was saving up for college, but her real dream was to move into Manhattan and work in the fashion industry. Still, she felt a little guilty about leaving. It would mean her mom would be all alone in the big house. Eliza's parents, who were both from Israel, had divorced about a year and a half before. Her father had moved back to Israel, leaving just her and her mom in New York. Eliza did have 2 older half-brothers from her mom's first marriage. One was also in Israel. The other, her 7-year-old half-brother Raviv, lived a short drive away. But they rarely saw him. Raviv was married with a new baby and was in charge of the family's struggling kosher cookie business. He was always busy, always stressed about money, and just didn't make it out to Staten Island much. Eliza got to the last page of her magazine and saw it was time to get ready for her 2 p.m. shift. But first, she wanted to check her messages on her online dating profiles. So she went over to her desk and logged into her computer. Back in 2005, internet dating was just taking off, and Eliza had made a few profiles to see what would happen. She'd started messaging and meeting up with men from all over the city, but she kept it a secret from her mother. She knew Seema wouldn't approve of her dating men who weren't from their Orthodox Jewish faith. Eliza knew this for a fact because it had happened with her last boyfriend, Hassan. He was a Muslim boy she'd met at her public high school. Her family had completely disapproved of the relationship because of his religion. The pressure became too much, and Eliza eventually broke up with him. So now, she was much more secretive. She'd make up excuses to go to other neighborhoods when really she was going on dates. She had even started secretly bringing some of the guys back to her house, always sneaking them in through the back door when her mom was at work. Eliza saw a few new messages and replied to them. Then she headed into the bathroom to take a shower. A few minutes later, she turned off the water and heard a noise from outside the bathroom. She'd heard a landscaping crew next door earlier, but this was different. It was a weird banging sound. Thinking it might just be the landscapers next door, Eliza stepped out of the shower and wrapped a towel tightly around herself. Then she slowly opened the bathroom door to see where the noise was coming from. But someone was already inside the house. That night, around 7:30 p.m., Eliza's mother, Seema, got home. She put her key in the front door, but it would only open a few inches. Something was blocking it. Confused, Seema shoved against the door until she could squeeze inside. The first thing she saw was that a heavy mirror had been propped against the door. Before she could process why, she turned on the lights and saw her living room was completely destroyed. Furniture was overturned, cabinets were open, and papers were everywhere. Sema immediately felt her heart start pounding. Someone had broken into the house. But then another thought hit her. Where was Eliza? Sema knew her daughter had been home. She started calling out her name, but there was no answer. She ran upstairs and saw that the door to Eliza's room was closed. She tried the handle, but it was locked. This was wrong. Eliza never locked her door. In a panic, Sema banged on the door, screaming Eliza's name. But there was only silence. She pulled out her phone and called the moving company. When Eliza's boss told her she'd never shown up for work, Sema's stomach dropped. With trembling hands, she hung up and dialed 911. About an hour later, Detective Michael Kenny of the NYPD arrived. The street was swarming with neighbors, and yellow crime scene tape was stretched across the front yard. He parked and walked to the house, where 2 patrol officers met him. They told him they'd responded to a robbery call, had to break down a locked bedroom door, and inside, they found the body of one 8-year-old Eliza Parsy. The officers said the whole house was torn apart, but they couldn't find any sign of a forced entry. They pointed to Sema, who was standing nearby with a young man. Kenny knew he'd have to talk to her, but first, he needed to see the scene for himself. Inside, the living room was a mess, but Kenny noticed that valuable items like the TV and stereo were sitting out in the open, untouched. That was unusual for a burglary. He went upstairs to Eliza's room. It was also ransacked. Clothes were everywhere, and the mattress was pulled off the bed, leaning against a wall. In the middle of the floor was Eliza's body. She was naked, with a towel bunched up underneath her. Kenny asked a crime scene tech if this was how they found her. The tech said no. When they first arrived, Eliza had been underneath the mattress with a pillow over her face. They had to move both to examine her. Kenny knelt down but couldn't see an obvious cause of death, no bullet or knife wounds. This suggested she might have been suffocated, maybe with that pillow. He asked if they'd found any signs of injury. The tech pointed to a few tiny drops of blood on the towel. They were small and could have been old. But all the details, a naked young woman, the mattress, the pillow, the blood, made Kenny suspect she had been sexually assaulted before she was killed. He told the tech to collect the blood and any other fluids as evidence. A few minutes later, Kenny went outside to speak with Sema. She was crying on the shoulder of a young man who immediately stepped forward when he saw Kenny. He demanded to know why they couldn't see Eliza and why the police weren't out arresting her killer. Kenny took a deep breath. This was clearly Eliza's brother, and his anger was understandable. Kenny calmly explained that to find the killer, he needed information, starting with where he and Sema had been that day. The man lowered his voice and introduced himself as Raviv. He and Sema both said they had been at work all day and had alibis. Kenny then asked if they knew anyone who would want to harm Eliza. He saw them exchange a knowing glance. Raviv immediately said Kenny should look into her ex-boyfriend Hassan. Sema added that just a few weeks ago, Eliza had woken up to find Hassan sitting at the end of her bed, just staring at her. She said it terrified Eliza, who had no idea how he'd gotten inside. Before Kenny could ask another question, Raviv suddenly started yelling at someone across the yard. "Get out! We don't want you here!" Kenny turned and saw a teenage boy standing there, looking scared. Raviv then turned back to Kenny and yelled at him to arrest that boy, Hassan, because he was the one who killed Eliza. Late that night, Detective Kenny sat in an interrogation room with Hassan. So far, Hassan had been cooperative, but he didn't have a solid alibi for the time Eliza was likely killed. Kenny had taken a DNA sample from him, as well as from Sema and Raviv, to compare against the evidence found at the scene. But DNA results took weeks back in 2005, so Kenny hoped for a confession. He asked Hassan if he had ever snuck into Eliza's house. Hassan didn't deny it. He admitted he had, but insisted he was just trying to talk to her to get back together. He said Eliza wasn't terrified, just annoyed, and told him to leave. Kenny noted the difference between Hassan's story and Seema's. He asked why Eliza's family disliked him so much. Hassan hung his head and said it was about religion. He was Muslim and they were Orthodox Jewish. Kenny wasn't sure what to believe. Was Hassan an obsessive ex-boyfriend, or were they just star-crossed lovers? Either way, he had a motive and a history of sneaking into her house. But with no confession and no hard evidence, Kenny had to let him go. The next day was Eliza's funeral, held so quickly due to Orthodox custom. Kenny had just received the autopsy report. It confirmed Eliza died from asphyxiation, likely smothered by the pillow. The medical examiner also found semen showing she'd had sex within 24 hours of her death and skin cells under her fingernails suggesting she fought back. But here was the twist. The report concluded the sex had been consensual. There were no signs of sexual violence. This meant the killer was likely a romantic partner, which seemed to clear her family. But it also didn't seem to be a random burglar since nothing was stolen. At the synagogue, Kenny saw two groups, members of the Orthodox community and Eliza's friends from school. He stood in the back of the men's section and watched. The atmosphere was solemn. Then, suddenly, the energy in the room shifted. Everyone turned to look at the entrance. It was Hassan. He was trying to make his way to the casket. Raviv saw him, marched straight over, shoved him, and yelled at him to get out. Before a fight could break out, other men separated them and escorted Hassan out of the building. 2 weeks later, on August 24th, Kenny was with the NYPD computer crime unit. Eliza's friends had told him about her secret online dating life. The IT specialists dug into her computer and found a message thread with a man named Jonathan. They were making plans to meet at her house for sex on August 9th, the day before she was killed. Eliza told him to come to her house while her mom was at work and that she'd leave the back door unlocked so he could sneak in. This plan matched the crime scene perfectly. Kenny tracked Jonathan down. He admitted he'd gone to her house and they'd had consensual sex, but he insisted he never went back to Staten Island after that. He gave a DNA sample without hesitation. Weeks passed and the case went cold. Kenny had nothing solid on Hassan or Jonathan. Then, on September 13th, the medical examiner called. The DNA results were in. The semen sample didn't match the skin cells under Eliza's fingernails. There was DNA from two different men. The semen belonged to Jonathan, confirming his story of consensual sex the day before. The skin cells found under Eliza's fingernails from her desperate fight for her life belonged to her half-brother, Raviv. Raviv was angry at his mother. The family cookie business she'd passed to him was failing, and he felt humiliated living in his in-laws' basement with his wife and new baby. He knew Seema had money from her recent divorce, money he felt was rightfully his. So on August 10th, instead of driving his delivery route, he went to his mother's house to steal it. He didn't know Eliza's work schedule had changed and that she would be home. Before searching the house, Raviv dragged a heavy mirror in front of the front door, creating a barricade in case someone unexpectedly came home. When he went into Eliza's room, he was shocked to find her coming out of the bathroom. He knew she would tell their mother what he was doing. In a panic, he tackled her, smothered her with a pillow until she stopped fighting, and then staged the scene to look like a robbery gone wrong. He then left, only to return hours later after his mother called him, pretending to be a grieving brother. Raviv eventually pleaded guilty to first-degree manslaughter and was sentenced to 18 years in prison. In the end, the person demanding justice the loudest outside the crime scene was the same person who had killed Eliza only hours earlier. Raviv had publicly blamed Hassan, comforted his grieving mother, and stood beside detectives pretending to mourn his sister. But the entire time, the killer had already been there. Hours earlier, when Seema called Eliza's workplace searching for her daughter, Eliza was already dead inside the house. And the person she should have been safest around turned out to be the one she needed protection from most. Thanks for listening. Let me know your thoughts on this case in the comments below. If you want to watch more true crime stories, check out the playlist linked on screen. Until next time. On the afternoon of the 2nd of May, 1962, doctors at a small hospital in central Haiti officially declared 40-year-old Clavius Narcisse dead. His sister, Angelina Narcisse, stood beside his bed as a sheet was slowly pulled over his body. Just 2 days earlier, Clavius had been completely healthy. Then, almost overnight, he developed a terrifying fever and began coughing up blood. As Angelina watched him take his final breaths, something about the moment felt wrong. Clavius's eyelids kept twitching, almost like he was still trying to wake up. A horrible rattling sound came from deep in his throat. Then, suddenly, nothing. The doctors pronounced him dead. His family buried him the next day. And everyone believed the story was over. Except, 18 years later, Clavius came back. Not as a rumor. Not as a ghost story. But as a real man standing in the middle of a crowded market, claiming he remembered everything, including the moment he was nailed shut inside his own coffin. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So, if that's of interest to you, please tell the like button, you'll help it move next weekend, but then on moving day, you just block its number. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Angelina was devastated, but also confused. The doctors said Clavius died from malignant hypertension, but they had no idea what caused it to come on so suddenly. The family drama didn't help. Clavius had inherited all their parents' land and money and refused to help his struggling siblings. Because of this, Angelina was the only one who had shown up at the hospital. The rest of the siblings only appeared for the funeral the next day. They watched as his casket was closed and lowered into the ground. As far as everyone was concerned, the story of Clavius Narcisse was over. Fast forward 18 years to 1980. Angelina was walking through an outdoor market in her village when a thin, older man approached her. His face was sunken, and a long, deep scar ran from his mouth to his ear. In a gravelly voice, he told her his name was Clavius and that he was her brother. Angelina was shocked. She thought the man was crazy. This person looked nothing like her brother, and besides, Clavius was dead. She told the man to leave her alone, but he grabbed her and insisted he was telling the truth. A crowd gathered, and a police officer soon arrived and dragged the man away. At the police station, the man told an absolutely insane story. He claimed that 18 years ago, he wasn't dead, just paralyzed. He said he was mentally aware of everything. He heard the doctor pronounce him dead. He felt the cold of the morgue. He heard them nailing his coffin shut and even felt one of the nails pierce his cheek, which is how he got the scar. He was trapped inside his own body, waiting to suffocate underground. But then, later that night, he felt his coffin being lifted. 2 men pried it open, pulled his body out, and tied him up. They carried him for days into the wilderness until they reached a building in the middle of a huge sugarcane plantation. Inside, an old man, a voodoo priest known as a bokor, poured a liquid into his mouth and started chanting. Slowly, Clavius found he could move again, but his body felt jerky and uncoordinated. His mind was hazy and slow. The bokor handed him a machete and forced him to work in the fields, alongside dozens of other people who moved in the same strange, unnatural way. He had been turned into a zombie. Clavius told the police he was forced to work as a slave on that plantation for 2 full years. His ordeal only ended when one of the other workers attacked and killed the bokor. Suddenly, they were all free. But Clavius didn't go home. He knew the bokor hadn't chosen him randomly. He'd been hired. And Clavius was certain it was one of his own brothers who paid the Bokor to do this, all because of the inheritance dispute. Fearing for his life, Clavius spent the next 16 years wandering around Haiti, just trying to survive. He only decided to return home after he heard that the brother he suspected had recently died. The police were stunned. The story sounded impossible. But, just in case, they asked Angelina and her siblings for a list of questions that only the real Clavius could answer: childhood secrets and specific family memories. They sat the man down and asked him the questions, one by one. He answered every single one of them correctly. It really was Clavius. Years later, a Harvard researcher named Wade Davis investigated the case and uncovered the science behind the story. It's believed Clavius's brother rubbed a fine powder on his skin. The powder contained tetrodotoxin, a powerful neurotoxin from pufferfish that can induce a death-like state of paralysis with a nearly undetectable heartbeat. This is why doctors thought he was dead. After he was buried, the Bokor's men dug him up. The liquid he was forced to drink contained a hallucinogenic plant that kept him in a suggestible, zombie-like state, easy to control and force into slave labor. The brothers' plan was a cruel revenge. But by the time Clavius returned and told his story, both his brother and the Bokor were long dead. No one was ever brought to justice for the 18 years they stole from him. Clavius went on to live with his sister, Angelina, and the rest of his family until he passed away for good in 1994. Clavius Narcisse was declared dead, buried underground, and somehow returned nearly 2 decades later with a story that still feels impossible to explain. Let me know what you think really happened in this case down in the comments. And if you want more strange and mysterious stories like this one, check out the playlist linked on screen. Until next time. On the afternoon of Wednesday, the 12th of April 2006, a dentist named Dr. John Yelnik was finishing up with his last patient of the day. He was working at his practice in the small rural community of Blairsville, Pennsylvania. He gave the patient a new toothbrush, a friendly smile, and told her to come back in 6 months for her next checkup. After she left, he walked into his back office and started to pack up his things for the day. Once he had everything, he walked back out through the empty reception area. He saw his receptionist getting ready to leave and told her to have a great night. She smiled and waved back as he walked out the door. But as soon as that door closed behind him, the smile completely vanished from John's face. The truth was, he was pretending. Pretending to be happy all day at work was becoming more and more exhausting. In reality, his life was filled with problems, and he was struggling under the weight of it all. He walked across the parking lot, got into his car, and started the short half-mile drive from his office to his house. John had grown up in Blairsville. It was his hometown, and it had always been his dream to build a life and raise a family right there. When he graduated from dental school 13 years earlier, he could have easily moved to a big city. He probably would have made a lot more money right away. But that wasn't what he wanted. Instead, he chose to come back home and join the practice of the very same dentist who had looked after his teeth when he was a kid. And it turned out to be a great decision. John's practice became incredibly successful. He had a natural charm, and he was especially good with children, which made his office a popular choice for families all over the area. He started making a lot more money than he ever expected. He was smart with it, too. He took the extra income and invested it in real estate. By the time he was in his 30s, John Yelnik was a millionaire. But for John, true success wasn't about the money. He felt like his life was truly complete when he met a woman named Michelle. Michelle was a single mother with 2 kids of her own. For John, this was perfect. It meant he was getting a ready-made family, something he'd always wanted. Some of his friends were a little worried. They quietly suggested that maybe Michelle was just interested in him for his money. But John never believed that. And any doubt he might have had disappeared when his own mother got sick with cancer. Michelle stepped up without a second thought and became his mother's full-time caregiver. To John, that was all the proof he needed. It showed him that Michelle's love for him was real. So, in 1997, John and Michelle got married. Shortly after, they decided to adopt a little boy together, who they named JJ. With Michelle's 2 children and now JJ, they had a big bustling family of 5. They moved into a beautiful large house with a swimming pool and a hot tub in the backyard. From the outside, and for a while on the inside, it seemed like they had the perfect life. But now, as John pulled his car into the driveway of a different, much more modest house, he just sat there for a moment, staring at it. This was where he lived now. And he couldn't help but wonder how everything had fallen apart so completely, so quickly. The big house with the pool was a distant memory. These days, John was struggling with money. He'd always been a generous person, and he had loaned tens of thousands of dollars to various people over the years. But now, he was in the uncomfortable position of having to ask for that money back simply because he needed it to get by. His marriage was in an even worse state. He and Michelle had hit a rough patch that just never ended. It got to a point where they both admitted to having affairs. They were now living separately, which is why John was here at this small, quiet house instead of the family home he had built with so much hope. But the financial stress and the pain of his failing marriage were not the worst things in John's life. There was a third, much darker stressor that was consuming him. For the past couple of weeks, John had become absolutely convinced that someone was trying to kill him. It all started about 2 weeks earlier when he found his car had been vandalized. Someone had covered it in spray paint. The police came and took a report, but they couldn't find any suspects. Logically, having your car spray painted doesn't automatically mean someone wants to murder you. But John couldn't shake the feeling that this was different. It felt deeply personal, like a direct message. He felt like he was being targeted. Over the next few days, that feeling grew from a small worry into a full-blown conviction. He was so sure that his life was in danger that he took a drastic step. He went to his attorney's office and gave her $10,000 in cash. He told her that if he ended up dead, she should use that money to investigate his murder. John finally got out of his car, walked up the porch steps, and went inside his lonely house. He closed the door and locked it behind him, a habit he'd developed recently. The silence inside was overwhelming. It only amplified how depressing the small house felt. He wished his son JJ was there. When JJ was around, the whole house felt alive and full of energy. But with the separation, John didn't get to see his son very much anymore. Sometimes, long stretches of time would pass between their visits, and John missed him terribly. He took off his shoes and walked into the living room. There, on the coffee table, was a stack of legal documents he'd been trying to ignore. They were divorce papers. Michelle had actually filed for divorce 3 years earlier, back in 2003, but the process had dragged on and on. They hadn't been able to reach an agreement. To be clear, they weren't fighting to save the marriage. That was long over. In fact, Michelle was already living with a new boyfriend, a Pennsylvania state trooper named Kevin Foley. The one thing they were fighting over, the reason the divorce had stalled for 3 years, was their adopted son, JJ. Michelle wanted full custody, and John was fighting with everything he had to not let that happen. He couldn't bear the thought of losing his son. But John knew that in less than 24 hours, this long, painful battle would finally be over. Their lawyers had at last worked out a shared custody agreement. Michelle had already signed her part of the paperwork. The next day, it would be John's turn to sign. He sat down on the couch and flicked on the TV, but he couldn't focus on it. He felt restless, on edge. He picked up the phone and called his aunt, who he was very close to. They talked for a while about the divorce and the custody agreement. He told her how relieved he was that it was almost over. When they finally said their goodbyes, John hung up the phone. He laid down on the couch, not even bothering to go to his bedroom, and soon he drifted off to sleep. The next afternoon, around 3:30 p.m., a 9-year-old boy named Zach Hughes walked out of his house and across the lawn towards John's house next door. Zach was hoping to see if John's son, JJ, was home and wanted to play. He knew JJ split his time between his mom's and dad's houses, so it was always a bit of a guess whether he'd be there. But as Zach got to the front steps of John's house, he stopped dead in his tracks. He saw that a small glass panel to the left of the front door was completely shattered. There were shards of glass all over the porch. And underneath the broken panel, he could see streaks of a dark red liquid that had dried on the house and the porch floor. Zach's heart started pounding. He knew instinctively that it was blood. His first impulse was to turn and run as fast as he could back to his own house. But then he thought about his friend, JJ. What if JJ was inside? What if he was hurt or in trouble? Zach felt like he couldn't just leave without making sure. So, mustering up all his courage, the little boy slowly walked up the rest of the steps. He tried the doorknob, but it was locked. So, being as careful as he could not to cut himself, Zach reached his small hand through the broken glass panel. He felt around on the inside, found the lock, and turned it. He pushed the door open and took a hesitant step inside. The first thing he saw was chaos. Papers were scattered everywhere across the floor of the foyer. And then he saw it. Lying motionless on the floor, in the middle of all the papers, was a body. It was covered in blood. At that moment, all of Zach's courage vanished. He turned around and ran out of the house, screaming for help. About 15 minutes later, Corporal Janelle Lead of the Blairsville Borough Police Department was in her car with her husband and their 4 children. Her radio crackled to life with a call from dispatch. A 911 call had come in from a normally quiet residential street. The details were a bit vague. Dispatch told her it was a possible cardiac arrest and that her presence was needed at the scene. That was all the information they had. Thinking it was just a routine medical call, maybe an elderly person having a heart attack, Corporal Lyde drove her family straight to the address. But the moment she pulled up and got out of her car, she knew this was no cardiac arrest. A patrol officer was waiting for her on the front porch, and his face was grim. As she walked up to him, he pointed to the shattered glass panel and the dark stains on the porch. She asked him what was going on, saying she'd been told it was a heart attack. The officer just looked at her and said, "You know what? It's probably best if you just go in and look for yourself." Lead turned and gave a quick, reassuring wave to her husband and kids, trying to signal that everything was fine and she'd just be a minute. Then she stepped through the front door. The scene that greeted her was shocking. The entire foyer was splashed with blood. It was on the floor, on the walls, everywhere. And there, in the middle of it all, surrounded by those scattered papers, was a man's body. It was the most brutally mutilated body she had ever seen in her entire career. Now, Corporal Lyde had never actually worked a homicide case before. But as she stood there, trying and failing to count the number of stab wounds on the victim, she knew one thing for certain. This was not a heart attack. This was a murder. And it was now her first case. She also realized she was in a potentially dangerous situation. Because the call had been mistakenly logged as a cardiac arrest, a full police response hadn't been sent. It was just her and the one patrol officer on the scene. For all she knew, the killer could still be somewhere inside the house. And her entire family was sitting in a car just a few feet away. She immediately ordered the patrol officer to clear the rest of the house to make sure no one else was inside. Then she went back outside and stood in the front yard, positioning herself between the house and her family's car, her hand resting on the butt of her gun. It was a terrifying few minutes, but luckily she soon heard the sound of approaching sirens in the distance. At the same time, the patrol officer came back out of the house. He told her it was empty. The killer was gone. The only other thing he had found was a huge puddle of blood in the basement where it had soaked through the floorboards from the foyer above. At this point, more officers were arriving. Lade told her husband to take the kids and go home. She kissed them goodbye and then switched back into detective mode. She went back inside the house to begin her investigation. It was around this time that another officer told her the victim's name. It was Dr. John Yelnik. As crime scene technicians began the painstaking work of collecting evidence, Corporal Leeds started her own slow, methodical walkthrough of the home. She wanted to get a sense of who John was and figure out exactly what happened to him. John's body was near the front door, but it was obvious that the attack had been long and chaotic. There was blood spattered all over the living room, which was where the scattered divorce papers were. John's body was barefoot. However, there were several bloody shoe prints in the house that were clearly not his. They were far too large to belong to Zach, the little boy who found him. Lead figured they must belong to the killer. The crime scene techs were already measuring the prints, trying to determine the shoe size. As she continued her search, she didn't see anything that looked like an obvious murder weapon. She also saw no signs of a robbery. The television was still there, electronics were untouched, and no drawers or cabinets seemed to have been ransacked. This made sense to her. The sheer violence of the attack suggested it was deeply personal. The killer hadn't come here to steal anything. They had come for one reason only: to make sure John Yelnik died a horrible death. She finished her sweep of the house and ended up back in the living room, which she believed was where the attack had started. That's when she noticed a check sitting on the coffee table right next to some of the divorce papers. The check was made out to John Yelnik for $15,000. Attached to it was a handwritten note. The note asked John to please wait a few days before he deposited the check. The check and the note were signed by someone named Melissa Yuse. When Leeds saw the last name, she did a double take. Hughes. That was the last name of the little boy, Zach, who had found the body. She wondered if Melissa Hughes was related to him, maybe his mother. In that moment, Corporal Lead realized she had her first two solid leads. Her victim was in the middle of a very messy divorce. And someone, possibly his next-door neighbor, owed him a lot of money that they apparently didn't have right at that moment. It was getting dark by the time Lead finally stepped back outside the house. A crowd had gathered on the street, a mix of curious neighbors and reporters. Murders were extremely rare in Blairsville, and she knew this was going to be a huge story. She just wanted to get back to the station and start organizing her thoughts for the interviews she needed to conduct. But before she could leave, another officer approached her with an update. Police had been going door to door, talking to the neighbors, to see if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual the night before. And they had come back with two very interesting pieces of information. The first came from a woman who said that the previous night, around 1:30 the morning, she was woken up by the sound of a scream. She said she sat up in bed and listened, but the screaming didn't continue, so she eventually just went back to sleep. The second piece of information came from another neighbor who also heard something around that same time. This neighbor heard a man yelling like he was in a very heated argument. They couldn't make out most of what was being said, but they heard one sentence yelled very clearly, "I'll never loan you money again." As soon as Lead heard that, her mind went straight back to the $15,000 check on the coffee table. This seemed to support the theory that the murder was about money. But the officer wasn't finished. He said there was one more thing. In addition to those witness statements, several of John's neighbors had told the police that there was one particular family on the block that detectives really needed to look into. And that was the Hughes family. Because, according to neighborhood gossip, Melissa Hughes and John Yelnik had been having an affair. The next day, April 14th, Corporal Lead was at the police station. She was sitting in an interrogation room across a small table from Melissa Hughes and her husband, Tom. This was Lead's first murder case, but she was a very methodical person. She had a clear plan. She was going to question Melissa and Tom very aggressively, even though in her mind they weren't her top suspects. Her number 1 and 2 suspects were John's estranged wife, Michelle, and her new boyfriend, Kevin Foley. She knew from her training that in a murder investigation, a divorcing spouse and their new partner are always the first people you look at. The night before, Lead had sent an officer to Michelle's house to inform her of John's death. But when the officer arrived, Michelle already knew. She told the officer she had heard that John died of a heart attack. The officer then had to deliver the difficult news that it was not a heart attack, it was a murder. According to his report, both Michelle and her boyfriend Kevin seemed genuinely shocked and upset by this. Corporal Lead actually knew Kevin Foley personally. He was a state trooper, and they had even worked together on cases in the past. Now, she was faced with the very awkward and sensitive task of investigating a fellow police officer. It was a very tricky situation. So, her plan was to gather as much information as she could before she confronted Michelle and Kevin. She wanted to try and rule out the uses first. She was also waiting for the results of the autopsy, which was scheduled for later that day. Now, sitting in the interrogation room, she looked at Melissa and Tom. She started by asking them about the $15,000 check. Melissa answered in a shaky voice. She explained that she and John had been good friends since they were in 9th grade. She was planning to open a new bakery in town, and John, being the generous person he was, had loaned her the money to help her get started. But then, she said, he had suddenly asked for the money back. Melissa said she was a little disappointed, but she also knew he was going through a very expensive divorce, so she understood. She explained that when she wrote the check, she only had $14,000 in her bank account. That's why she left the note, asking him to wait a few days before cashing it so she could get the last $1,000 together. Lade watched Melissa very closely as she spoke. She seemed genuinely devastated by John's death. The issue with the money seemed like a minor detail to her compared to the loss of her friend. The obvious warmth Melissa felt for John raised another, more sensitive question. Lade decided she couldn't avoid it, even with Melissa's husband sitting right there. She looked directly at Melissa and asked her bluntly, "Were you having an affair with John?" Melissa's face immediately turned red. She stammered and said, "No, absolutely not." She insisted they were just very close friends, nothing more. At this point, Lead turned her attention to Melissa's husband, Tom. She asked him the same question. Was his wife having an affair with John? For a moment, Tom was completely silent. When he finally spoke, he didn't sound angry. He just seemed incredibly nervous. He completely avoided the question. Instead, he just kept repeating that he really needed to go, that he had to take care of his kids. Lead knew it was a blunt question, but Tom's reaction was extremely suspicious. By the time the interview was over and she let them go, Tom Hughes had firmly established himself in her mind as a serious person of interest. Before she left the station for the day, Lead checked in with the officer she had sent to observe the autopsy. He told her that the forensic pathologist had determined the killer used a knife with a one-sided blade to slash John repeatedly. In addition to the stab wounds, John's jugular vein had been severed by a piece of glass. He also had numerous defensive wounds on his hands and arms and cuts on his back, which suggested that at some point he had tried to run away from his attacker. Lead already knew the murder was brutal, but hearing the clinical details from the autopsy report reinforced just how violent and personal it was. Her first thought was that whoever did this must have truly hated John. And she already had a suspect, Tom Hughes, who had a powerful motive for hate, a potential affair between his wife and the victim. Despite her inexperience with homicide cases, Lead felt confident. She believed that if she was just allowed to work the case her way, slowly and methodically, she would be able to solve it. But she also knew that the case was getting a lot of media attention. There would be immense pressure from her superiors and the public to get results quickly. If she moved too slowly, she worried the case might be taken away from her, or another, larger police agency might be brought in to help. She didn't want that to happen, but she also refused to compromise her careful process. She would have to find a balance. The officer who observed the autopsy had brought back several evidence containers from the medical examiner's office. They contained John Yelnik's fingernail clippings, blood samples, and other tissue samples. Standard procedure was for Lead to immediately send these off to the state police crime lab for DNA testing. But as she held those samples, she made a decision. She was not going to do that. She wanted to keep all of her options open. She needed to maintain complete control over every single piece of evidence in this case. So, after the other officer left, Corporal Lyde walked over to the department's evidence refrigerator, placed the container of samples inside, closed the door, and went home for the night. The next day was April 15th, 2 days after the murder. By this point, Corporal Lyde had spoken to a number of John's friends and family members. They all painted a similar picture of him. They said he was a great guy, a generous friend, and above all, a very dedicated father. Today, Lead was heading to John's dental practice to speak with his colleagues. She wanted to see if they had a different perspective, and she was glad she did. As soon as she arrived, the dental hygienist and the receptionist had a lot to say, and it was all about John's estranged wife, Michelle. They told her that during the long 3-year divorce battle, Michelle had made some very serious allegations against John. She had accused him of abusing their adopted son, JJ. The accusations were investigated, and even Michelle's own family didn't believe her. Officials ultimately declined to press any charges against John. But at one point, Michelle accused John of violating a stay-away order, and the police had come to the dental office and arrested him in front of his staff and patients. To John's colleagues, Michelle was a nightmare. They said she also called the office all the time, demanding money, and John would usually give in just to keep the peace. But, according to one of the hygienists, Michelle had called just a few days before the murder, and that time, for the first time, John had refused to even take her call. This detail immediately caught Lead's attention. It wasn't just his colleagues who described Michelle as being obsessed with money. Many of John's friends said the same thing. They said it was Michelle who had pushed for the big flashy house with the pool. John had never been comfortable with that kind of lifestyle. To his friends, it was this fundamental difference between them that ultimately drove them apart. Lade started to piece together a possible motive. Maybe John and Michelle had a major fight about money just days before he was killed. Michelle calls, demands money, and John finally says no. Could that have been the final straw? Could that have pushed Michelle to do something drastic? Maybe, but Lead also learned something else. Michelle was still listed as the primary beneficiary on John's life insurance policy. If he died, she stood to inherit millions of dollars. So now there was a powerful two-pronged financial motive for Michelle to want John out of the picture. But there was a problem with this theory. It seemed unlikely that Michelle, on her own, would have been able to physically overpower a grown man like John and inflict such horrific injuries. It seemed more likely that John would have been able to fight her off. But then Lead considered another possibility. Maybe Michelle didn't do it herself. Maybe she hired someone to do it for her. Someone bigger, stronger. And with the potential of millions of dollars in insurance money, she certainly would have been able to afford it. As Lead left the dental office, she started to think about how she would approach her interview with Michelle and her state trooper boyfriend, Kevin Foley. Given the sensitivity of investigating another cop, she knew she couldn't make a move without having all her facts in order. This wasn't just her first murder case, it was the biggest case of her career. The media was calling her non-stop. She was determined not to screw it up. John Yelnik's funeral was held on Wednesday, April 19th, 6 days after his murder. Corporal Lead knew that his friends and family were growing frustrated. To them, it seemed like the investigation was moving at a snail's pace. Lead understood their impatience. The case was under a huge public microscope from day one. And there was the strange fact that John himself had been paranoid that he was going to be murdered. It was either a bizarre coincidence or a chilling premonition. But Lead felt that the family didn't understand what she was doing. She wasn't just being slow, she was being careful. That was her process. Without any official guidance on how to run a homicide investigation, she was developing her own careful, methodical system and for the next several months, she stuck to it. The crime lab hadn't found any usable fingerprints or foreign DNA at the crime scene. The bloody shoe prints didn't match any of her initial suspects. So, for the time being, her investigation relied almost entirely on interviews. She chased down every single tip and rumor, no matter how small, and systematically ruled them out one by one. And all the while, she kept a close watch on her three main suspects: Tom Yuza, Kevin Foley, and Michelle Yelnik. But she made no move to arrest anyone. The public complaints, and especially the criticism from John's own family, sometimes got to her. But she was convinced she was on the right path. She just needed more time. That was until Melissa Use decided to hire a pair of psychics. It was the summer of 2006, about 3 months after the murder. Lead got a call from Melissa. She was surprised to hear from her, and even more surprised when Melissa asked to meet at John's house. When Lead arrived, Melissa was standing on the sidewalk, but she wasn't alone. With her were two older women who Melissa introduced as a pair of psychic sisters. She explained that she had met them at a psychic tea party and that they had been having visions about the case. Lead was not happy about this. And she was even less happy when she learned that John's family, desperate for answers, had given the psychics permission to go inside the crime scene. But Lead also knew that John's family was at the end of their rope. If she wanted them to give her more time to conduct her investigation properly, she needed to play along. If that meant working with psychics hired by the wife of one of her suspects, then so be it. So, Lead followed Melissa and the two psychics as they walked into John's front yard. The sisters started talking about feeling hot and cold patches of energy. Lead did her best not to roll her eyes. They then went inside the house, which had been sealed but not yet cleaned. It was still splattered with John's blood. The psychics announced that they had a premonition that the killing had happened in the dining room area. They said they could see a knife and stab wounds and a bloody footprint. They declared that the killer drove a black or red car, and most importantly, they said that the killer was not Melissa's husband, Tom. Melissa seemed very excited by these revelations, but to Lead, it was all ridiculous. The bloodstains all over the house made it pretty obvious where the attack had taken place. The details about the stab wounds and the police investigation had been all over the local news for months. Anyone could have known those things. And the fact that these psychics, who were hired and brought there by Melissa, were now conveniently clearing her husband of any involvement was not convincing at all. As the group finally left the house, the only thing Lead could think was that the psychics had maybe, just maybe, bought her a little more time by taking some of the pressure off. She knew that John's family had completely lost faith in her abilities. But what they didn't know was that she still had an ace up her sleeve. She just had to wait for the perfect moment to play it. Fast forward to February of 2007, 10 months after the murder, Corporal Lead finally got her chance. John's cousins, fed up with the lack of progress, made an official plea to the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office asking them to take over the investigation. Lead's reluctant cooperation with the psychics had bought her some time, but ultimately, John's family and Melissa Use had become more and more agitated by her slow pace. They felt the psychics had given them more information than the police had. The Attorney General reviewed the case and agreed. Corporal Lead was being taken off the case. On the surface, this was her worst nightmare. A bigger, more powerful agency was coming in to take over her investigation, just as she had feared. But, on the other hand, the agency taking over was the Attorney General's office, not the state police. And when she realized that, she knew her moment had finally arrived. This was the play she had been waiting almost a year to make. Lead went to the Blairsville police station. She walked to the evidence refrigerator and took out the small sealed container. Inside were the fingernail clippings and tissue samples that had been collected from John Yelnik's body during his autopsy. She had been ordered to send them to the state police crime lab 10 months ago, but she had disobeyed that order. In a total breach of protocol, she had hidden them away and waited. Now, with the Attorney General's office publicly taking over, the case had a much higher profile. It was no longer just a small-town murder. This new status gave Lead the leverage she needed. She could now justify sending the evidence to a much more powerful lab, bypassing the state police entirely. She could send it to the FBI crime lab in Quantico. Normally, the FBI wouldn't get involved in a case like this, but with the Attorney General's involvement, she knew they would accept it. So she carefully repackaged the samples, filled out the new paperwork, and sent the evidence off to the FBI. And then, she waited. The day the results came back, Lead was a nervous wreck. She knew there was a very real chance that her risky gamble was about to backfire, that she was about to look like a fool for sitting on crucial evidence for almost a year. But as she sat at her computer and opened the email from the FBI lab, her eyes widened. She read the report and then read it again. She couldn't believe it. Her strategy of intentionally slow-playing the investigation, of hiding the evidence and waiting for the right moment, had paid off in a way she could have only dreamed of. Finally, after all this time, she was looking at the name of John Yelnik's killer. Based on the evidence collected at the crime scene and the DNA results from the FBI, this is a reconstruction of what authorities believe happened in the early morning hours of the 13th of April, 2006. Around 12:30 a.m., a red car pulled onto John Yelnik's quiet residential street. The driver killed the engine and the headlights, and the car coasted to a stop in front of John's modest brick home. The killer got out and scanned the dark street, making sure no one was watching. The neighborhood was silent. The killer walked around to the back of the house and slipped inside through an unlocked door. Once inside, they moved quietly through the dining room and into the living room. There, they saw John Yelnik, asleep on the couch. The killer was holding a single-edged knife. They walked right up to the couch, raised the knife high, and brought it down hard into John's body. John woke up instantly, screaming in pain and shock. He threw his hands up to defend himself, clawing and scratching at his attacker, managing to get skin and blood from the killer underneath his own fingernails. He thrashed and rolled off the couch, desperate to escape. He managed to get to his feet and stumble away, but the killer was right on him. The two men wrestled and fought in the small living room. The killer stabbed John again and again. During the struggle, one of them knocked into the coffee table, sending the stack of divorce papers flying across the room. Somehow, running on pure adrenaline, John broke free from the killer's grasp. He made a desperate run for the front door, trying to get outside, trying to get help. He made it to the front foyer and reached for the doorknob. But just as his hand touched it, the killer shoved him from behind with tremendous force. John flew forward, and his head crashed through the small pane of glass to the left of the door. A shard of broken glass sliced deep into his neck, severing his jugular vein. John collapsed to the floor and bled to death right there in the foyer. The killer stood and watched until John was completely still. Then they turned, walked back out the way they came in, tracking John's blood across the floor and out the back door. The killer was confident they would never be caught. After all, people trusted this person. They trusted this person with their lives. The killer was Michelle Yelnik's new boyfriend, Pennsylvania State Police Trooper Kevin Foley. The fact that he was a cop was the entire reason Corporal Lead had decided not to send the evidence to the State Police Crime Lab. Lead knew Kevin. She had worked with him and generally liked him. But as her investigation progressed, she kept hearing stories about how much Kevin seemed to hate John. He had apparently believed the false allegations Michelle had made about John abusing JJ even after they were proven to be unfounded. Lead had become increasingly paranoid that if Kevin was the killer, she couldn't risk the state police lab handling the evidence. She worried that evidence could be covered up, either by Kevin himself or by his colleagues trying to protect one of their own. The risk was just too great. So, she made the incredibly risky decision to hide the evidence. She slow-played her investigation for 10 long months, biding her time, waiting for an opportunity to get those samples to a lab she could trust. That opportunity came when the Attorney General's office took over the case, giving her access to the FBI. The FBI scientists found male DNA under John Yelnik's fingernails. And when they ran that DNA through their database, it came back as a direct match to State Trooper Kevin Foley. In the end, Kevin Foley was arrested and found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As for Michelle Yelnik, she stood to inherit millions from John's death, and her boyfriend was the one who committed the murder. But she was never charged with any crime in connection with the case. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. It was just after midnight, specifically around 12:30 in the morning on August 9th, 2013, when Kyle Lawson was woken up by his cell phone ringing. He was in bed with his wife at their home in San Angelo, Texas, and the sound cut right through the quiet of the night. Kyle groggily reached for the phone, squinting at the screen in the darkness. The caller ID showed it was his younger brother, 26-year-old Brandon. That was a little strange, a call this late, but he answered it. Kyle put the phone to his ear, but before he could even get a hello out, Brandon's voice came through, frantic and rushed. He said he needed help right now. And then he launched into a story that sounded completely unbelievable. Brandon told Kyle that he was driving his truck north on Highway 277. Now, this highway is a classic West Texas road, just 2 lanes stretching out into what feels like a whole lot of nothing. It's desolate, especially in the middle of the night. There aren't many lights, not much traffic, just open, empty country. And according to Brandon, he wasn't alone out there. He said there were 3 men and they were chasing him. To make things worse, he told Kyle that his truck was about to run out of gas. He was on fumes. His voice was high-pitched with panic. He was practically begging Kyle. He needed him to bring a gas can out to him to meet him somewhere along the highway so he could refuel and get away from these guys who were on his tail. He stressed that Kyle had to be secretive about it, that he couldn't let the other men see him. As Kyle listened to all of this, lying there in his bed, he wasn't really feeling scared for his brother. At least, not in the way Brandon wanted him to be. He wasn't picturing a high-speed chase with dangerous men. Instead, Kyle's main feeling was just deep, heavy annoyance. He was almost certain that there were no 3 men. He was sure that his brother Brandon was just high again and was having a paranoid, drug-induced hallucination. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened. You see, Brandon had a history with methamphetamine. It was a struggle he'd been fighting for a while. For the past 6 months, he'd actually been doing really well. He'd been clean, he was working hard, and he was trying to be a better partner to his fiancée, Ledessa, and a better father to his 4 young children. He seemed to be turning a corner, and the whole family was proud of him. But just 2 days before this late-night phone call, Brandon had called Kyle for a very different reason. He had asked Kyle if he knew where he could get some drugs. Kyle, of course, didn't give him any information. He did the opposite. He pleaded with his brother, telling him, "Don't do it, man. You're doing so good. You're clean. Don't throw it all away." But Kyle had a sinking feeling that his words hadn't gotten through. He was pretty sure that even though he hadn't helped, Brandon had found a way to get drugs anyway. Because ever since that phone call 2 days ago, Brandon's behavior had been erratic and unpredictable. He just wasn't acting like himself. In fact, the only reason Brandon was even out on Highway 277 at this hour was because he'd gotten into a huge fight with Ledessa. Kyle knew this because he'd spoken to his parents earlier in the evening. The plan was for Brandon to drive to their parents' house to cool off for the night, to get some space. He was essentially in a timeout for his bad behavior at home. So him being on this specific road at this specific time made sense in that context. But the story about being chased by 3 men, that part didn't make sense at all. Not in the real world, anyway. So, Kyle knew his brother was almost certainly high. And he also knew that trying to reason with him in this state was a waste of time. Telling him, "Brandon, there's no one chasing you, you're just high, you need to go to mom and dad's house," would be pointless. Brandon wouldn't hear it. He was in his own reality right now. So Kyle shifted his strategy. He didn't argue. He just tried to calm his brother down, to soothe the panic in his voice. He used a low, steady tone, trying to be the anchor in Brandon's storm. But it wasn't working. Brandon didn't calm down. If anything, he got more agitated, more anxious. He kept talking about the three men, saying they were getting closer, that he was running out of time. The desperation in his voice was escalating with every word. Finally, Kyle just had to ask the question that was hanging in the air. He said, "Dude, Brandon, have you relapsed?" Is that what's happening here? As Kyle expected, Brandon completely denied it. He swore up and down that he was not high, that this was real, that he was in serious trouble. He went right back to begging Kyle to come help him, to bring the gas can so he could escape. "Please, Kyle, you have to hurry. They're going to get me. Just bring the gas. Please, man, come on." At this point, Kyle felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. There was no point in continuing this conversation. Part of him just wanted to hang up the phone, roll over, and go back to sleep. He had his own life, his own family, his own responsibilities. He was a husband and a father. He couldn't spend his life babysitting his younger brother through self-inflicted crises. But at the same time, underneath the frustration, Kyle loved his brother. They were very close. And even though he was 99% sure there was no real danger from these imaginary men, there was still a tiny sliver of doubt. And what if Brandon was in danger from himself? What if he crashed his truck or wandered off into the dark? Kyle sighed. He knew what he had to do. He made a decision. He told Brandon, "Okay, I'm on my way. I'll be right there." Then he hung up the phone. About 45 minutes later, Kyle was driving north on that same dark and empty highway, 277. His wife was in the passenger seat next to him, and their 4-year-old son was asleep in his car seat in the back. His wife had insisted on coming. She hadn't wanted him going out alone in the middle of the night to deal with his brother, especially not when he was in such a strange state of mind. So now, the whole family was out on this rescue mission. As Kyle drove, he scanned the darkness on both sides of the road. This part of Texas is wide open. Even at night, you can see for a long way. The landscape is mostly flat plains, dotted with some low shrubs and a few small trees. It's the kind of place where a set of headlights or taillights would be visible for miles. It would be very easy to spot another vehicle. But Kyle saw nothing. There were no other cars. There was no truck that looked like Brandon's. There was certainly no sign of 3 other men in pursuit. The road was completely empty. He just kept driving, peering out into the darkness, checking the fields on either side just in case Brandon had somehow veered off the road. That seemed like a real possibility given the state he was in. But there was nothing. Then, finally, way up ahead, he saw it. A dark shape parked on the shoulder, half on the pavement and half on the dirt. It was a truck. The lights were off. It wasn't running. It was just sitting there, silent in the night. As Kyle got closer, he could see that it was his brother's truck. He'd found him. Kyle pulled his own car over to the opposite side of the road and parked. He turned to his wife and told her to stay in the car with their son, to lock the doors. He said he was just going to go over and talk to Brandon. In his mind, he was picturing Brandon sitting in the driver's seat, high as a kite, waiting for him. He figured he'd have a firm talk with him, get him to go to their parents' house, and this whole bizarre night would be over. The fact that there were no other cars around just confirmed his theory. The 3 men were a fantasy. But when Kyle walked across the highway and got to Brandon's truck, he peered through the driver's side window and his heart dropped a little. There was no one inside. The truck was empty. Brandon was gone. This didn't make any sense. Kyle was confused. On the entire drive out there, Brandon had been calling him repeatedly, call after call, his voice getting more and more frantic. "Hurry up, Kyle! You gotta get here! They're gaining on me! Bring the gas, man! I'm in trouble!" And now, Kyle was finally here, standing right next to the truck, and his brother was nowhere to be found. He hadn't said on the phone that he was leaving the truck. Where could he possibly have gone? Kyle started looking around the immediate area. He even crouched down and looked under the truck, feeling a bit ridiculous. Was his brother hiding? As he was standing there, trying to process this strange scene, his phone rang again. It was Brandon. Kyle, now deeply annoyed and confused, answered it with a sharp, "Brandon, where are you?" Brandon's voice came back, calm for the first time that night. He just said, "Bro, I'm right here." Kyle looked around wildly. "No, you're not. I don't see you. Your truck is here, but you're not." But just as he said that, Kyle saw a pair of headlights coming down the highway toward them. The vehicle was slowing down. As it got closer, he could see the light bar on the roof. It was a police car. A sheriff's deputy was pulling up to the scene. And as this was happening, as the police car was rolling to a stop right in front of him, Brandon's voice came through the phone with an urgent whisper. "Run away from that cop." In that split second, Kyle realized something important. Brandon had to be close by. He had to be watching this whole scene unfold. He could see Kyle, he could see his truck, and he could see the deputy arriving. But Kyle was looking all around him, out into the flat, open fields, and there was simply nowhere to hide. The landscape was barren. There were a few scattered shrubs and some small trees far off in the distance, but nothing close by that could conceal a grown man. So where was he? Kyle was getting furious. This whole thing was a ridiculous game. He knew why Brandon wanted him to run. Brandon had an active warrant out for his arrest related to a drug charge. He was trying to avoid any contact with law enforcement. Kyle was already out here in the dead of night with his family in the car, trying to help his brother who was clearly not in his right mind. And now Brandon wanted him to run from the police? It was too much. Kyle was about to yell into the phone to demand that Brandon show himself, but before he could say another word, Brandon hung up. By now, the deputy had parked his cruiser and was walking over to Kyle, who was still standing next to his brother's abandoned truck. The officer introduced himself as Deputy Neal from the Coke County Sheriff's Department. He said he was responding to a 911 call from a truck driver who had reported a vehicle stranded on the side of the road. He asked Kyle if the truck belonged to him, if he was the one who needed help. Kyle knew he should tell the truth, but the instinct to protect his brother was strong. He couldn't just tell the deputy that his brother was likely high on meth, hiding somewhere in the nearby fields, and also had a warrant for his arrest. So, he made up a story. He told the deputy that the truck belonged to his brother and that his brother had called him saying he'd run out of gas. He suggested that Brandon had probably started walking down the road to find a gas station. He then asked the deputy if it would be okay if he and his family just drove up and down the road a bit to look for Brandon. Surprisingly, Deputy Neal seemed to buy it. He just said, "Yeah, that's fine." "Go ahead." So Kyle walked back to his car, got in with his wife and son, and started driving farther north, away from the scene. As he drove, he kept looking in his rearview mirror. He could see Deputy Neal still parked next to Brandon's truck. Once he was sure he was far enough down the road that the deputy couldn't see him, Kyle pulled over again. He took out his phone and started calling his brother, over and over and over again, his anger growing with each unanswered call. But Brandon never picked up. At this point, it was nearly 2 a.m. Kyle's 4-year-old son in the back seat was awake and crying. He was tired and scared. Kyle's wife was exhausted. And Kyle himself had reached his limit. He looked at his wife and said, "That's it. I'm done." Brandon was an adult. He had tried to come out and help, to get him out of whatever mess this was. But if Brandon didn't want to be found, if he wanted to hide in a field and play these games, then that was on him. Kyle had a family to take care of. He was going home. He turned the car around and drove back south, right past the spot where his brother's truck was still parked. Deputy Neal was still there, standing beside it, presumably waiting for Brandon to return. Kyle didn't stop. He just kept driving, heading home to put his son and this crazy night to bed. He figured he'd hear from Brandon in the morning with some wild story to explain everything. He was frustrated, but he wasn't yet truly worried. A little while after Kyle and his family drove past, Deputy Neal decided he couldn't just wait there all night either. He'd done a quick search of Brandon's truck. There was nothing suspicious inside. But importantly, there was no phone, no wallet, and no keys. These were the things a person would take with them if they had indeed run out of gas and decided to walk for help. The story Kyle had told seemed to hold up. So, Deputy Neal figured Brandon was fine, just off on foot somewhere. He had other calls to respond to. So, he reached into the truck, turned on the hazard lights so it would be visible to other drivers, locked the doors, and then he got back in his own car and left. The next morning, around 8 o'clock, Deputy Neal drove back out to Highway 277 on his patrol. He wanted to check if Brandon had eventually made it back to his truck. But when he got to the spot, the truck was still there, sitting exactly as he had left it, its hazard lights still blinking. Now, a little bit of concern started to creep in for Deputy Neal. It was one thing to be gone for a few hours in the middle of the night. It was another to still be gone well into the next morning. It was possible something bad had happened to Brandon while he was on foot. Maybe he got lost, or fell and hurt himself, or maybe he was even hit by a car. Deputy Neal decided he needed to follow up to try and find Brandon and make sure he was okay. He drove back to the sheriff's department to look up contact information for Brandon Lawson. But as soon as he walked through the door, another employee stopped him. They told him that while he was out, the department had received a call from a woman named Ledessa, Brandon's fiancée, and the story she told was very different from the simple ran out of gas story that Kyle had given him. Ledessa explained that she and Brandon had been fighting. She confirmed that he was supposed to be driving to his parents' house to cool off on the night he disappeared. But he never made it to his parents' house. And he never came back home to her either. No one in the family had seen or heard from him since that night. They had all been calling and texting his phone, but there was no response. Brandon was officially missing. Hearing this, Deputy Neal was surprised and, frankly, pretty angry. He felt like Kyle had lied to him, that he deliberately downplayed the seriousness of the situation. His first move was to go and talk to Kyle and the rest of Brandon's family to get the full, unfiltered story. And it quickly became clear that the family hadn't been trying to hide a crime. They had been trying to protect Brandon from his warrant and from himself. They genuinely believed, just like Kyle did, that this was another drug-induced episode and that he would eventually turn up. But now that he was truly gone, their fear was real. They told the police everything they knew, including his history of drug use. They were begging the police to find him. And so, a massive search was launched. For the next 4 days, Deputy Neal led a huge effort covering the area around where Brandon's truck was found on Highway 277. They had teams on foot, they used search dogs, they even had helicopters in the air. Some of the search teams used thermal imaging cameras, which can detect body heat, making it possible to find someone even if they are hiding or unconscious. But despite scouring this vast, open area, they found absolutely nothing. No footprint, no piece of clothing, no sign of a struggle. They also interviewed people who lived or owned property in the general area. They asked if anyone had seen a man walking, or a strange truck, or maybe even the 3 men Brandon had claimed were chasing him. But no one had seen anything out of the ordinary. It was as if Brandon Lawson had simply vanished into thin air. Faced with a total lack of evidence, the authorities came to a conclusion. They believed that given Brandon's fight with his fiancée, his active arrest warrant, and the complete absence of any sign of him, he must have fled. They decided he was not a missing person in the traditional sense. He was a person who had chosen to disappear. He wasn't in the area because he had left on his own terms. And with that, the official search was called off. It seemed like an open and shut case of a man running from his problems. That is, until Ledessa, Brandon's fiancée, walked into the sheriff's station with a piece of paper that changed everything. It was August 13th, 2013, 4 days after Brandon had disappeared. The official search had just been terminated. An officer at the Coke County Sheriff's Department sat across from Ledessa, who looked distraught. She told him that she'd been so worried she had started digging into their shared cell phone records looking for any clue. And she had found something that terrified her. She slid a printed-out call log across the desk and pointed to a single entry. The officer saw that it was a record of Brandon's calls from the night he went missing. In between all the frantic calls to his brother Kyle, there was another one, made at 12:50 in the morning. Brandon had called 911. Ledessa explained why this was so chilling. Brandon was terrified of the police. He had a warrant. He would do anything to avoid them. She knew that he had even told his own brother to run from Deputy Neal that night. For him to voluntarily call 911 himself, she said, meant that he must have believed his life was in immediate mortal danger. He must have been out of all other options. It made no sense that he would call for help and then seemingly run away from it. This was a complete shock to everyone at the sheriff's department. Up until that moment, they believed the only 911 call had come from a trucker reporting a stranded vehicle. They had no idea that Brandon himself had also called for help. It turned out that the local 911 dispatch center was a small, underfunded operation. In the confusion of the night, someone had simply failed to pass along the information about Brandon's call to the responding deputies. It was a critical error. Now that they knew about it, they had to hear it. They contacted the dispatch center and got a copy of the audio recording. When they played it, a chill went down their spines. First, Brandon's voice. He did not sound like someone who had simply run out of gas. He sounded like he was in the middle of a life-or-death situation. He was breathless and panicked. But the second thing, the most disturbing thing, was that if you listened very, very closely, you could hear what sounded like another person's voice in the background, on Brandon's end of the line, right before the call disconnected. The call went like this. The dispatcher answered, 911 emergency. Brandon's voice came through, choppy and fast. Yes, I'm in the middle of a field. A state trooper is pushing guys over. Right here, going toward Abilene on both sides. His words were jumbled, hard to understand. My truck ran out of gas. There's one car here. Got chased into the woods. Some guys, the dispatcher, confused, said, okay, now run that by me one more time. Brandon then seemed to be talking to someone else, not the dispatcher. He said, we're not talking to him. Then, to the dispatcher again, I accidentally ran into them. The dispatcher asked, you ran into them. Okay. Then Brandon said something truly chilling. Got the first guy. The dispatcher asked, do you need an ambulance? Brandon replied, yeah. No, I need the cops. The dispatcher tried to clarify, okay. Is anybody hurt? But there was no response. Just silence. Hello? 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 The line was dead. Suddenly, this wasn't just a missing persons case anymore. This might be a homicide. The reference to being chased, the other voice, the cryptic phrase, got the first guy, it all painted a much darker picture. The search, which had just been called off, was immediately resumed, but this time it was bigger, more intense. For the next full year, law enforcement and volunteers poured countless, but they found nothing. Not a single clue. He was just gone. Eventually, the case went cold again. The authorities may have moved on, but Brandon's family never did. Ledessa hired 2 different private investigators over the years. They conducted their own extensive searches, not just around Highway 277, but all over the state, following up on any potential lead. But they also came up empty. As the years went by, Brandon's disappearance became a well-known internet mystery featured on podcasts and television shows. Theories swirled. Maybe he was just high and wandered off, falling victim to the elements or wild animals. Maybe the three men were real and they had kidnapped and killed him. Or maybe the original police theory was right and he had successfully started a new life somewhere else. For 9 long years, there were only questions. Then, in January of 2022, a small group of independent searchers, volunteers who had become fascinated with the case, decided to go out to Highway 277 one more time. They went back to that same area that had been searched by hundreds of people with dogs and helicopters and advanced technology. And while combing through a field right off the side of the highway, these volunteers found what all the others had missed. They found an old, weathered pair of shorts and pieces of 2 white sneakers. They immediately called the sheriff's department. Deputies arrived, secured the area, and began their own meticulous search. Not far from where the clothes were found, they discovered it. A small fragment of a human skull. The remains were sent for DNA testing, and soon the results came back. They belonged to Brandon Lawson. You would think that finding his remains would finally bring some answers. But instead, it only deepened the mystery. The location where his skull fragment was found was incredibly close to where his truck had been parked. It was in the primary search area, the very place that had been gone over with a fine-tooth comb again and again for years. How could everyone have missed it? Remember, this isn't a dense forest. It's a flat, open West Texas field. It's hard to imagine how the remains of a grown man, along with his clothing and bright white shoes, could have gone unnoticed for 9 years. So where does that leave us? We're left with 2 impossible-sounding scenarios. The first option is that for 9 years, hundreds of searchers, professional canine units, and helicopters with thermal cameras all somehow missed Brandon's body, which was lying right there in the open field where they were looking. That he was there the whole time, and everyone was simply blind to it. The second option is that he wasn't there. That during those initial searches, Brandon's body was somewhere else entirely. But if that's true, it raises even more questions. Where did he go after that 911 call? And, most disturbingly, how did his remains end up back in that field nearly a decade later? We can reconstruct his last known movements. He argued with Ledessa. He drove off, likely under the influence of drugs. His paranoia escalated until he believed men were chasing him. He called his brother for help. His truck ran out of gas. He got out and made a terrifying 911 call where he spoke of being chased and mentioned he got the first guy. He saw a deputy arrive and warned his brother to run. And then he vanished. 9 years later, a piece of him reappeared, almost exactly where his journey ended. The discovery of his remains gave his family a painful, partial closure. They finally knew he was gone. But the how, the why, and the who, if there was a who, remain a profound and haunting mystery. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. On the morning of the 18th of November 2019, a 54-year-old detective named Musi McKay stood in a long, slow-moving line. He was waiting to get into a courthouse in the city of Ikapa, South Africa. Musi was an investigator, a good one, and today he was on court duty for a very violent robbery case that was, at long last, finally going to trial. The robbery itself had happened nearly 6 years earlier, a lifetime ago in police work. Back in 2014, a group of armed men had stormed into a couple's farmhouse just outside of the city. It was a brutal, terrifying home invasion. The men beat the couple severely before they ransacked the home, making off with everything they could carry: electronics, jewelry, a collection of firearms, and other valuables. It was Musey and his team who had worked the case tirelessly. They eventually identified, tracked down, and arrested the criminals responsible. And in a stroke of good police work, they were even able to recover some of the stolen items. Now, as he stood in that line, Musey was holding one of those recovered items. It was a piece of evidence he was scheduled to present in court today. He had done this kind of thing countless times over his long career. Stand in court, present the facts, show the evidence. It was part of the job. But today, he felt a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that was different. It wasn't just the trial prep. He was juggling other active cases, mentoring junior detectives who looked up to him, and he was feeling every one of his 54 years. Musey wasn't the young, energetic officer he used to be. He was getting close to retirement age, and the weight of all his obligations was starting to press down on him. The biggest source of his fatigue, though, was this robbery case itself. It had been an excruciatingly long and complicated process. There were an unusual number of delays, legal challenges, and procedural hurdles that had dragged it out for 6 long years. It had taken so long to bring this case to trial that the very piece of evidence Musey was now holding had actually been returned to the victim couple. The system figured they might as well get to use their property again until the court finally got its act together. Getting the case to this point had been a marathon, not a sprint, and it had drained him. But Musey and his team were absolutely determined to see it through. The men they had arrested weren't petty thieves. They were incredibly violent. They needed to be behind bars, for the good of the public. They had beaten the couple so badly that both of them had ended up in the hospital with serious injuries. It was a miracle they hadn't been killed during the home invasion. Justice, however delayed, was essential. As Musey finally reached the front of the line and entered the courthouse, he passed through the security checkpoint. He gave the guards a nod, hoping they were on high alert today. In his experience, violent offenders, like the ones on trial, often had equally violent friends, especially in this region where this kind of crime was unfortunately common. It wasn't unheard of for associates or gang members to try and disrupt court proceedings, sometimes even retaliating against police officers or the prosecution right there in the courthouse. But the security check was smooth. There were no suspicious people loitering, no signs of any trouble. Musey felt a small measure of relief as he made his way down the corridor and into the designated courtroom. He pushed open the heavy wooden door and saw that the room was already full. The defense team was there, the jury was seated, and the public gallery was packed with observers. He walked towards the front of the court. Musey went over and took a seat at the prosecution table. He would stay there until it was his turn to approach the judge and present the state's case, which would include him formally introducing this piece of evidence. As he got settled into his chair, he placed the evidence carefully in his lap. He turned and gave a quick, subtle wave to the prosecutor, a woman named Adelaide Ferreira-Watt, who was sitting next to him at the table. She was deeply focused, reviewing her notes one last time. Musey had worked with Adelaide on several cases before. They had a good working relationship, built on mutual respect. In his mind, she was a total professional, sharp, and dedicated. He knew that with her leading the prosecution, their chances of getting a conviction were very strong. Adelaide looked up, saw his wave, and returned it with a brief, confident smile before her eyes went back to the papers in front of her. Musey took another slow look around the courtroom. Everything seemed quiet, orderly. There was no sign of any gang members or friends of the accused trying to intimidate anyone. The air was still and tense with anticipation, as it always was before a major trial began. Musey just hoped it would stay that way. He hoped the trial would go smoothly and end with the verdict he and the victims had waited 6 long years for. A few minutes later, the judge entered, called the court to order, and the trial officially began. Adelaide stood up, straightened her robes, and began to present the case for the prosecution. At that very moment, despite waiting all these years to finally get here, Musi didn't feel a surge of adrenaline or excitement. Instead, a profound wave of exhaustion washed over him. It was almost like relief, the feeling that the final chapter was beginning and his long involvement was almost over. The courtroom was also quite warm, stuffy from all the bodies packed inside. The combination of the heat and his deep fatigue was potent. Before long, his eyelids started to feel heavy, like tiny weights were attached to them. He fought to keep them open, to focus on Adelaide's opening statement, but her voice began to sound distant, muffled. His head felt like it was filling with cotton. Eventually, his head slumped over to the side, his chin resting on his chest. And right there, in the middle of the trial he had worked so hard for, Musi MK dozed off. At first, everything was fine. For a couple of minutes, he slept, and nobody seemed to notice or care. The trial continued on around him. But then, a sudden, loud scraping sound ripped through the quiet of the courtroom. It was the sound of dozens of wooden chair legs being dragged across the floor all at once. The jarring noise woke Musi up abruptly. He was startled, his heart pounding in his chest. As he jolted awake, disoriented and confused, the evidence he had been holding in his lap slipped from his grabber. It clattered onto the floor beneath the table. He blinked, trying to get his bearings. He was embarrassed. Had anyone seen him sleeping? What was that noise? He saw that people were getting up, moving around. He looked down and saw the evidence on the floor. His first instinct was to get it back before anyone noticed his blunder. He ducked under the table, scooped the item back up, and as he was sitting back up in his chair, he heard a deafening bang echo through the courtroom. It was sharp, explosive, and utterly out of place. He still had no idea what was going on. The room had erupted into chaos. And then he heard a scream coming from his right. He turned his head and realized the scream had come from the prosecutor, Adelaide. Musi looked over the table and saw her on the ground. She was clutching her hip, and a dark stain was rapidly spreading across her clothing. Her hip was gushing blood. She had been attacked. That loud bang he had heard, it was almost certainly a gunshot. Musi's mind instantly jumped to his earlier fear. The criminal's friends must have stormed the courthouse. They had gotten a weapon inside, and they had attacked them. They had shot Adelaide. His training kicked in. Were there more shooters? Were there other attackers in the building? Musi, who had only been awake for about 30 seconds, was still trying to process the frantic scene. He began scanning the courtroom, looking for a perpetrator, a gunman, anyone who looked like they were part of an attack. But he saw nothing of the sort. All he saw was the chaos of terrified people trying to flee the room and a few brave individuals rushing towards Adelaide to try and help her, to render aid. There were no attackers. There were no gunmen. There was just panic and confusion. For a moment, Musi just sat there, almost paralyzed by the shock of it all. He was still shaking off the fog of sleep, trying to make sense of the scene in front of him. He looked around the chaotic courthouse again, his eyes darting from face to face. No gunman, no perpetrator, nothing. And as that fact settled in his mind, it could only mean one thing. A cold, horrifying realization began to creep into his mind as he looked down at the object he now held in his hands. To understand what really happened inside that courtroom, you first have to understand a specific detail about South African police procedure. Normally, as in most countries, after evidence is collected from a crime scene, it's carefully examined, catalogued, and made safe. Then, it's transferred to a secure exhibit room where it stays under lock and key until it's time for trial. This ensures the integrity of the evidence and the safety of everyone in the court. However, in South Africa, there can be exceptions to this strict procedure, especially in cases with extreme delays. And this trial, as we know, had taken almost 6 years just to get started. Because of that immense time lag, some of the evidence recovered from the robbers' hideout has been returned to the original victims. The shotgun that was stolen from their farmhouse was one of those items. The idea was that they should be allowed to have their property back while the justice system took its sweet time. When the trial was finally scheduled, the couple had returned that particular piece of evidence to the police that very morning. Detective Musi McKay had been the one charged with bringing it to court. He was responsible for holding on to it. But in the rush of preparing for the long-awaited day, a critical step was missed. Musi, or someone on his team, had failed to double-check the evidence, to re-examine it, and make sure it was safe to be brought into a crowded courtroom. Sometime after Musi had fallen asleep, the judge had announced a short recess. The loud scraping of chairs that had startled him awake was simply the sound of everyone getting up to take a break. But for Musi, deep in sleep, the sudden noise was like an explosion. He had sat up suddenly, confused, and in that disoriented moment, he dropped the evidence onto the floor. And it turned out that was the worst possible thing that could have happened. Because that particular piece of evidence was the shotgun recovered from the robbers. When Musi, in his panicked, instinctive state, saw the shotgun on the ground, he had one thought: get it back before the judge or prosecutor saw that he'd fallen asleep and dropped it. He reached down quickly to scoop it up. But the shotgun, because it had never been re-examined after being returned by the victims, was still loaded. And as Musi hastily grabbed it from under the table, his finger accidentally hit the trigger. The gun fired. The blast hit Adelaide Ferreira-Watt in the hip, severing a major artery. The wound was catastrophic, and it would prove to be fatal. Musi was so confused by the chaos and the suddenness of it all that at first he didn't even realize he had been the one to fire the gun. He just scooped it up, heard the bang, and immediately thought they were under attack. It was only when he scanned the room and found no gunman, no other explanation, that he looked down at the shotgun in his own hands. And he realized it was aimed in the direction of where Adelaide had been standing. He must have been the one who shot her. In the end, Musi MK pleaded guilty to culpable homicide and negligence. For his role in the tragic death of his colleague, he was ordered to serve a 6-year prison sentence. However, that sentence was fully suspended. On the morning of the 14th of July, 1912, a 21-year-old athlete named Francisco Lazaro stood in his hotel room in Stockholm, Sweden. He was carefully getting dressed, preparing himself for the most important day of his life. Francisco was in Sweden to run the marathon in the Olympic Games. A marathon is a grueling long-distance race covering exactly 26.2 miles. For the world's most elite runners, it typically takes between 2 and 3 hours to complete. Francisco was representing his home country of Portugal. And this was a very big deal for everyone back home. It was Portugal's very first time participating in the Olympics, which meant Francisco was one of only a handful of Portuguese athletes at the Games. And out of all of them, Francisco genuinely believed he stood the best chance of bringing home a medal. He had a chance to do something truly historic, to put his country on the sporting map. Realistically, he wasn't even that nervous. He knew he was an incredible runner, one of the best in the world. Even though he was only 21, Francisco had already won 3 major marathons in Portugal. He was a star back home, a national hero in the making. But he also knew that winning on the world stage at the Olympics would require him to be more prepared than he had ever been in his life. So that's exactly what he had done. He had trained for months, pushing his body to its absolute limit. He had recently undergone a full medical examination to confirm he was in peak physical health. And he had even spent weeks thinking about the little details, the small ways he could give himself an edge over the competition. He thought about what to eat, what to drink, what to put in his body, and even what to put on his body. He knew that even the smallest thing, like a shirt that wasn't breathable or eating something that sat too heavily in his stomach, could be the difference between winning a gold medal and finishing in last place. The margins at this level were razor thin. Any little edge he could find, he was going to take it. So now, on the morning of the race, Francisco spent the next hour meticulously putting on the specific clothes he had selected and eating a perfectly balanced, light meal of carbohydrates and protein. It was all part of the plan he had mapped out. He had also been warned by race officials that it was supposed to be extremely hot on race day. But Francisco actually saw this as an advantage. He was from Portugal, where it often got much hotter than in a place like Sweden. He was used to the heat. He felt he knew how to protect himself from the sun and how to use the sweltering weather to his advantage against runners from cooler climates. Before he knew it, Francisco was ready. He left his hotel room and made his way to the stadium to compete in the Olympic marathon. A few hours later, around 1:45 in the afternoon, Francisco walked out into the middle of Stockholm's massive, sun-drenched stadium where the race was set to begin. As race officials directed him and the 67 other competitors to their places at the starting line, Francisco was feeling incredibly confident. So confident, in fact, that he called out to a nearby reporter who was covering the event. He told the reporter, with a grin, that he was going to be the winner, famously declaring, "I win or I die." As Francisco and the other runners took their spots on the starting line, they were standing in the direct sunlight, and it was unbelievably hot. In the shade, at the edge of the stadium, the temperature was already 90 degrees Fahrenheit. It was a sweltering, oppressive day. As Francisco looked up and down the line of his competitors, he saw that many of them already looked flushed. Their faces were red, and they were sweating profusely. They didn't look ready to run 26.2 miles in this heat. They looked overwhelmed before the race had even begun. But Francisco wasn't overwhelmed. He was prepared. In fact, he wasn't even sweating. As he stood there, waiting for the race to start, he could hear the roar of the thousands of people who had packed the stands. For a moment, he just stood there, taking it all in, appreciating how special this moment was. The marathon was a major event at these Olympics. The stadium was completely sold out. Even the King and Queen of Sweden were rumored to be somewhere in the crowd, watching. And as Francisco stood there, soaking in the atmosphere, he felt a deep certainty that when this race was over, all those people in the stadium and people all around the world, even royalty, would know his name. Just then, he heard the announcer's voice boom over the loudspeaker, telling the runners to take their marks. Francisco felt a surge of adrenaline. A hush fell over the crowd. He and the rest of the racers stopped moving, tensing their bodies, waiting for the signal. A few seconds passed in complete silence, and then, bang, the starting gun went off. Francisco and everyone else lunged forward. There was a bit of jostling as all the competitors surged off the line together, and Francisco found himself pushed back towards the middle of the pack. Right off the bat, he was a little surprised by how quick the pace was. But he still wasn't worried. He had studied the course maps extensively, and he knew he would have his chance to get out in front later on. This particular marathon route was very flat, but Francisco was used to competing in Portugal, which had much more mountainous and hilly terrain. So he was sure that once the other runners inevitably started to get tired, especially from the blistering heat, he would still be feeling fine. He could make his move then. So Francisco decided to hang back, conserve his energy, and wait for the right moment as the pack of runners moved out of the stadium and onto the dirt roads beyond. For the next hour and a half, he stuck to his plan. He kept his pace steady, running comfortably in the middle of the group. He knew that at some point, runners would start falling off as the heat and the distance wore them down. He would be able to make his way up through the field then. He wasn't rushing. He was just waiting, biding his time, staying confident. In fact, as he was keeping his pace, he was even able to give another quick soundbite to a reporter who was covering the race from the side of the road, telling her that he was feeling great. For the first half of this marathon, Francisco Lazaro felt like he was running the race of his life. It was as if everything in his training, his preparation, and his background had led him to this moment, to excel here on the world stage. He was consistently and easily moving past other runners. Some of them were really struggling in the heat, clearly not used to it. He saw some who had stopped running altogether, bent over with their hands on their knees, gasping for air. Others were just sitting on the side of the road, unable to get up. Basically, everything was playing out exactly the way Francisco had expected it to. He was slowly but surely making his move towards the front of the pack. However, as great as this race was going for him, something changed at around the 19-mile mark. All of a sudden, he just felt really off. His legs suddenly felt incredibly heavy, like they were made of lead. A few minutes later, his vision started to get blurry at the edges. Francisco kept running, telling himself he was fine, that this was just late race fatigue kicking in. And to be fair, it is pretty common for marathon runners to say that the real halfway point of the race isn't at 13 miles, but at around the 19 or 20-mile mark. That's the point where your body really starts to struggle. That last 6 miles is notoriously brutal. So he tried to rationalize it, telling himself that this was normal, that this happens when you hit mile 20. As Francisco worked as hard as he could to just put one foot in front of the other to keep going, he began telling himself that this pain was worth it. At the end of this, there was a stadium packed with people who would be screaming his name. He was still making such great progress. He could still win this race. But then, just a little bit later, his legs went from feeling heavy to completely giving out from under him. He slammed hard onto the hot, dusty ground, and then his whole body began to convulse. Within the hour at a local hospital, an emergency doctor greeted a crew of Olympic medical staff as they wheeled a man in on a stretcher. They quickly explained that the man's name was Francisco Lazaro and that he had collapsed in the middle of the marathon. The doctor wasn't particularly surprised by this. He knew the Olympic paramedics had been swamped all day, helping other marathon runners who had gotten sick from the oppressive heat. However, as soon as this doctor began to examine Francisco specifically, he knew that this case was different. It was much, much more serious. The other patients he had seen that day all had relatively mild symptoms, things like excessive sweating, general fatigue, and dizziness. They had all been easily treated by giving them water and cooling them off. But Francisco was twitching and convulsing uncontrollably. He was shouting deliriously, claiming that he had won the race. The doctor rushed him into an exam room and immediately took his temperature. When he saw the reading, he knew the situation was critical. It was 106.7 degrees Fahrenheit. A body temperature that high was often fatal. Francisco's organs were likely already shutting down. The doctor yelled for nurses and other medical staff to bring in water and ice, anything to cool him down. But Francisco did not respond to any of the hospital's treatments. As the hours passed by, his condition actually got worse. The doctor and his team worked tirelessly through the night, treating Francisco and trying to stabilize him. But the next morning, Francisco Lazaro died. After his death, that doctor just could not shake the feeling that something was off about what had happened. Yes, heat stroke can definitely be deadly, and Francisco had presented with a very severe case of it. But lots of other runners had gotten heat stroke during that same marathon, and all of them had recovered and were ultimately fine. So the doctor decided to run some tests on Francisco's body to see if maybe there was something else going on, perhaps an underlying illness or some other factor that was to blame for his tragic death. And when the doctor finally got those test results back, the answer made Francisco Lazaro famous all over the world. Remember, Francisco had put an incredible amount of thought into how to prepare for his big race. He trained hard, he ate right, he chose the perfect clothes, and critically, he took very specific measures to protect himself from the heat, which he knew was going to be a major factor. And at first, it seemed like all the measures he had taken had paid off. When he looked down the starting line and saw all the other runners pouring with sweat, their faces flushed, it seemed like they were already exhausted. But not Francisco. He wasn't even sweating. But not sweating in that kind of extreme heat was actually a very, very bad thing. Sweat is the body's natural and essential way of cooling itself down. When sweat evaporates from the skin, it takes heat with it. So Francisco's lack of sweat was actually a giant red flag, a sign that his body was in serious danger. And it was all thanks to what he thought was his secret weapon against the sun. It would turn out that Francisco, so determined to be prepared, had gone out and found what he believed would be the best and most powerful sunscreen imaginable. It was a substance called suet, which is a type of hard animal fat that's typically used in cooking or for making things like candles and soap. It's also sometimes used in skincare products because it's rich in nutrients. Francisco believed that because suet is so thick and waxy, it would act as a powerful barrier, protecting his skin from the intensity of the sun. So, just before the race, he had slathered a thick layer of suet all over his body. What he didn't anticipate was that this layer of fat would work far too well. It was so thick and non-porous that it clogged every pore in his skin. It created an impermeable seal, preventing anything from passing through, including his own sweat. And without any way to cool itself down, Francisco's body essentially turned into a furnace. As he ran for miles in the scorching heat, his internal temperature just kept climbing higher and higher, effectively cooking him from the inside out. The weekend after Francisco Lazaro's death, the Olympics held a memorial service for him. Over 20,000 people attended to pay their respects. It probably wasn't the kind of fame he had dreamed of when he stood on that starting line, but Francisco's name is still frequently referenced in Portugal today. When someone looks sick, pale, and bedraggled, the Portuguese sometimes say that they look like Lazaro. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya!